Glory Cloud Podcast, episode 121. Well, stay tuned for a new and final vision this week. Welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and I'm joined by our co-host, Pastor Todd Bordeaux of Cornerstone Orthodox Presbyterian Church in Houston, Texas. Welcome back, Todd.
Thanks, Chris. I can't believe we're on the last vision already. That went quickly, didn't it?
Gosh. Yeah, I was. As you said that, I was like, well, that escalated quickly.
Exactly.
But, man, so much rich material in here. It's... I'm almost disappointed that we're almost done.
Yeah, but where we're going is going to be exciting. The next book.
Absolutely. So, I mean, we're eager to wrap up Glory in Our Midst, and we're really looking forward to the next book in the series, but we've got some exciting stuff planned in the in-between time. So before we dive right into our material this week, I will just remind our listening audience that we do have our show notes page over at meredithkline.com/podcast. There you can find all of the resources that we mentioned during the course of an episode. If you do purchase anything from the website, it does help me out a little bit, and I'm certainly very appreciative of that. If you would like to support us free of charge, I mean, in terms of money, it only costs you a little bit of your time and energy to subscribe to the podcast and to give us a 5-star rating on iTunes. Both of those things help boost our visibility to other people who are looking for good theological content in their podcasts. And, Todd and I keep an eye on the stats each week, and it really, really does help when you do those things. We can see the numbers tick up. So thank you to those who are taking us up on our invitation to rate us and to subscribe. We can certainly see the benefits of that. And finally, if you do have the means to pitch in a little bit of money to help us cover the monthly cost of hosting the audio files, we do have a donate button at meredithkline.com/podcast on the right-hand side of the page, and any amount that you can give is very much appreciated, and Todd and I are very encouraged by that. So having said all of that, Todd, how would you like to kick us off this week?
Well, I do want to mention that in case our listeners are confused, that they may be looking at their Bibles thinking, why are we done? We're only halfway through Zechariah. Well, the book that Meredith wrote was really about the 7 visions in Zechariah, and the second half of the book parallels the first, but they're more oracles. And so he really wanted to focus on the visions, and even though obviously it's not an exact repetition of the first half, it does parallel the first half. Each certain oracle will parallel the vision. So if we did go through, we'd simply be returning to the theology we already saw in the visions. And so Kline is really bringing out the theology of the book using the visions, and that's why this week and next week we'll consider these 2 parts of chapter 6, which is the final vision.
Okay.
And go ahead.
I was just going to say, so Lord willing, we'll be finished with Glory in Our Midst next episode.
Yes, because this vision has 2 parts to it. And so we'll look at the second part, starting in verse 9 next week, and then that's when, Lord willing, will end. But given that, why don't you read the first 8 verses of Zechariah 6, and we'll go from there.
Okay, so this is Zechariah chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. Again I lifted up my eyes and saw, and behold, 4 chariots came out from between 2 mountains. And the mountains were mountains of bronze. The first chariot had red horses, the second black horses, the third white horses, and the fourth chariot dappled horses, all of them strong. Then I answered and said to the angel who talked with me, "What are these, my lord?" And the angel answered and said to me, These are going out to the four winds of heaven, after presenting themselves before the Lord of all the earth. The chariot with the black horses goes toward the north country. The white ones go after them, and the dappled ones go toward the south country. When the strong horses came out, they were impatient to go and patrol the earth. And he said, "Go, patrol the earth." So they patrolled the earth. Then he cried to me, "Behold, those who go toward the north country have set my spirit at rest in the north country."
Okay, now we're on the seventh vision, so as you can imagine that the number 7 would likely be the last vision and the vision that wraps everything up, as 7 often does in the Bible, and certainly in Revelation we see that. And so the seventh vision parallels the first vision. We've talked before about the chiasm of the 7 visions. The first and the last have similar material. And so the seventh vision is really answering the question that was brought up in the first vision by the Messianic angel, which was, how long, O Lord? How long until you come and deliver your people who are suffering here? And so now the seventh vision answers that question. And the sixth vision we looked at the last couple weeks focused on the judgment of the covenant people, lady wickedness and the thieves and the liars, concerned the apostates in the covenant community, the unbelievers. And so there was a separation. So it would make sense then that the seventh vision, again, would picture final judgment. So the very fact that it's 7 shows we're at the end. And then also, as it moves on from chapter 6, now that judgment has started in the household of God, it then moves out toward the world. And so the vision begins here with 2 mountains as Zechariah lifts up his eyes in this vision, and he sees the 4 chariots coming out from between 2 mountains. So Kline begins with our understanding of the mountains before he moves to the chariots. The mountains represent the presence of God. They're obviously, as mountains usually do in visions, they represent the very throne room of God, the heavenly council. And some people might ask, why are there 2 mountains? Well, it's a very common theme in Zechariah, but even a few places elsewhere, that God's presence is between 2 matching objects on either side. Vision 1, God was in the midst of 2 myrtle trees. Vision 5 with the candlestick, he's pictured as 2 olive trees. That was the presence of God. And Kline points out again, when you entered the temple, there were 2 pillars. And so that was the way to God's presence. And even in the ark, in the Holy of Holies, you had 2 cherubim over the Ark of the Covenant, picturing God's presence. And even Kline brings out, going back to Genesis 15, we have God taking an oath and this vision of the 2 legs of God, in a sense, the 2 pillars, as we saw, of the different types of fire in Genesis 15. And so often in the Old Testament, God is pictured with 2 matching or similar objects on either side. And so here his presence is pictured as 2 mountains. And Kline points out, even in the ancient Near East, the sun god would often appear in pictures between 2 mountains. And so what we have here then is sort of a gateway from heaven to earth. And that's even how it was pictured in the ancient Near East with the false gods. And then Kline brings up one other example, and that is in Deuteronomy 27. The ark is resting between 2 mountains where the covenant is established between God and Israel, Mount Ebal and Gerizim. And so it was in it was in the city of Shechem, representing the center of Israel. And so the 2 mountains would be the Lord establishing his presence in the land and saying, this land is now mine. The Canaanites had been defeated, or they will be defeated, The point is they will go and this land will become God's, the Lord's. And so in the same way, the two mountains in Zechariah is a picture of God saying, the world is mine. Just like God said to Israel, this land you're going in to conquer is mine already. And so in Zechariah 14, the parallel passage, you have two mountains again, and it pictures the return of Christ. The mountain splits and God's people are delivered. And so all that to say, the two mountains, we have the heavenly presence of Christ sending from heaven his chariots to do something. I think Kline makes that pretty plain, don't you?
I do. And I don't have a lot to add here except that even this is setting us up for our next series. The next book that Kline wrote after this was God, Heaven, and Harmageddon. And that's exactly what Kline is dealing with here in this particular vision of Zechariah is Harmageddon. And
right.
Yeah, stay tuned because we've got more of this good stuff coming.
And it may seem obvious, but I was listening to a YouTube video this week of a Messianic Jewish teacher teaching on Zechariah 6. And he was trying to make the case that the two mountains represent the evil nations and not the Lord. And one of his reasons for that is chariots picture death. And they picture war, negative things throughout the book of Revelation. So he couldn't attribute that to God. And so the mountains must picture the nations, sort of bringing war and judgment against Israel. And he was even defining Israel somewhat correctly as the new Israel, but he still couldn't see the mountains as the Lord. But he obviously failed to go throughout the rest of the book of Zechariah and to see the matching visions and that this is final judgment from the Lord. I mean, these chariots are coming from heaven in the vision, not from some false heaven or nation, but from the two presence of the Lord. So while it might seem obvious to us, I think it's good to go over it just to remind our viewers, our listeners. So the next part of the passage Kline tackles is this phrase that the mountains were bronze. And that's the end of verse 1. Now, what does it mean then that they were bronze? Well, bronze often is used in the Bible as a picture of the glory theophany, where God's presence is revealed in a visible way, usually in a vision, but even then it's usually bronze. For example, in Ezekiel's chariot, the creatures in Ezekiel's chariot have legs of bronze. And again, the chariot is the presence of God, the glory cloud on the chariot. In Daniel 7, the Son of Man, in that vision, it says he has arms and legs of bronze. And of course, I think we're all familiar with Revelation 1, where the Lord Jesus is described in a vision, and his legs are glowing bronze.
Okay.
And then at one other place, Kline brings up again, 1 Kings 7, that the pillars of the temple that led to the presence of God were bronze. Again, sort of picturing the legs of God, because the whole temple pictured the very presence of God.
Okay, that must be what I was thinking of, because I was going to say, weren't there objects in either the tabernacle or the temple that were bronze? And there we go, the pillars.
Right. And so bronze, if you follow it throughout the scripture, should remind us again that this is heaven. This is the very presence of God, who has just ordained something to happen and then sending out his angels to do that. And we'll look at that more in a moment. And so in Zechariah 6, the fact that these mountains are bronze reminds us of the shining divine presence of the Lord. And in this vision, he's ready to avenge his people. In a sense, the mountains would be coming up from the earth in the vision, as mountains do, So they're not floating mountains. And Kline says the idea here is that the Lord is planting his feet on the earth. The earth is mine, and he's about to do something to ensure that's going to happen.
Okay.
And so the next part of the vision that he explains is that the mountains picture Mount Zion. And of course, that's where the temple was built, on the mount. And so sometimes in the Bible, two mountains represent one mountain in visions. For example, in Isaiah 14:13, the mountain of the Lord is given two names, as if they're two mountains. One is Har Moed, which in the Greek obviously is Harmageddon.
Mm-hmm.
And translated, it's the Mount of Assembly. But in that same verse in Isaiah 14:13, it's also called the Mount Zaphon, which also means assembly. Now there's a secondary meaning of that, north. But Kline says that's not the meaning here. It's not the North Mountain. It's also the Mount of Assembly. And we'll see exactly why it's called that. And so Zaphon, it was known then as the most sacred mountain of the Canaanites. That was the home of Baal.
Oh, okay.
And yet in the prophecy, Isaiah uses it as the home of the Lord, because the Lord is going to establish his presence on the earth, and all this is his, as well as the heavens. And so Kline writes that Mount Zion then becomes the earthly manifestation of the heavenly mountain, the heavenly presence of God. And so the picture, in a sense, is of the earthly Mount Zion, even though there's two pictured here. Remember, it's a vision. Everything's not to be taken in a scientific exact sense.
Right.
And so we should be thinking Mount Zion. And Psalm 48:2 says, like the heights of Zaphon is Mount Zion, the city of the great king. And so they're putting those two mountains together. Mount Zion is like Zaphon. They're both the presence of the Lord ends up being there. Now, it's interesting, in the vision, the chariots go out and they go north and south. It starts off by talking about the four directions of the winds, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then it ends up that they only go north and south. And Kline says, again, if you picture that Mount Zion is the earthly representation of the heavenly mountain, the heavenly presence of God, then that's really the direction you would go if you were actually in Palestine, because the valleys run north and south. And so it makes sense that the chariots, obviously on the ground, when you think of Palestine being the picture, would only go north and south out the valley. And so that's why it starts off the four directions and then it moves north and south, because we are to picture the earthly Jerusalem and the earthly temple, the earthly mountain, as the presence of the Lord. And then Kline makes that interesting point that in Ezekiel, the Lord leaves earthly Zion. Remember the Ichabod, the glory of the Lord is no longer in the temple.
Right.
And yet we see in this vision that God's presence is on the heavenly Zion, as the brass pictures his shining, the bronze shining presence. And so he may have left earthly Jerusalem, but he never left heavenly Jerusalem in these visions here. And so what we have here then is the Lord is about to come and judge the world, to summarize where we're at so far.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts before we move on? This is a fairly short one because Kline doesn't do a lot of biblical theology on this one, and he'll save some of that for the next one. He really just wants us to understand what these pictures, the chariot, the mountain, what they each refer to as we put this all together. So any thoughts so far?
Well, I'll just let our listeners know that for Kline, this Mount of Assembly is incredibly important. He sees it as thematic throughout the entire Bible. from Genesis to Revelation. It's where God meets with his people. It's where major covenant transactions take place. And I think what you just said, Todd, about God never having left the heavenly Zion, but having left the Zion in Jerusalem is important, because it underscores what you've said in past episodes about, for example, the New Testament not teaching postmillennialism. The New Testament doesn't teach transformationalism. The point of all of this is the ultimate heavenly goal. It's not any geopolitical spot that we can point to on earth that we can plant a flag and say, this is the spot right here. Yes, what God has created is good. I'm not denying that, but it's not ultimate.
Right. And this gathering here, the fact that the mountains are called the Mount of Gathering, I forgot to say, it's really the gathering of the enemies of the Lord, as Revelation brings out. It's the final attack on the church. And it's at that final attack that God intervenes.
Okay.
Which is why it's called often a Mount of Assembly. It's not just the final assembly of God's people, which is true, that will end up being. But it's first the assembly of the enemies of the Lord. It's the closing in a sense. And we'll talk more about that as we get in this vision. Now, in the next section, Kline then talks about the chariots, and he calls it divine transport. Now, the very fact that this part of the book is called divine transport shows you that we should not take these as angels going away from the presence of the Lord. In other words, the presence of the Lord is on these chariots, and that's important for this vision. And so in Ezekiel, you have one chariot when the book starts, but the chariot has 4 faces. In Zechariah, you have 4 chariots. And Kline said it's simply the same meaning, but that's the way visions work. You just sometimes, you get it in different figures, but it's the same point. It's the presence of the Lord on these chariots. And notice verse 8, the Spirit is on the chariot and then sort of gets off the chariot, and he lands and he's enthroned there on the earth. So we shouldn't think of these chariots as leaving the presence of the Lord to do something for the Lord, but more in the sense of carrying the divine presence down to earth to judge. That's really the better picture. That does change it a bit when we think of final judgment is God himself coming down.
Absolutely.
And so Kline brings out then these chariots should bring us back, of course, to the first Exodus. Because, and not only we usually think of the chariots as far as the Egyptians riding chariots after Israel, but Psalm 68 describes the rescue of Israel as God going out in chariots. He's the rider of the clouds. And so when the songs were sung, the visions of the Exodus, they were described as God sending his chariots to rescue Israel. And so what do we have in Zechariah here? We have a new Exodus. God is delivering his people. The chariots are riding again to judge Egypt. Egypt here, of course, becomes the whole world in judgment, and rescue his people as either they're laying in the grave and waiting, or those who are alive, the enemies are closing in on the church. And he gives them their final deliverance through chariots. And so we definitely should think of the book of Exodus and see this as the true Exodus. And that's really why the first Exodus has such a major place in the Old Testament, is because it was always there to picture the second Exodus. It was always looking ahead. And even the prophets would say, God is going to do again for Israel something in such a deliverance that'll make the first Exodus seem like nothing in comparison. So everything is preparing you for the new covenant, what Christ would do in delivering us on the cross, and then the consummation of that here in final judgment where God redeems his people in that full sense of even their bodies. And so always think, when you see chariots here, second Exodus. First Exodus, second Exodus.
Okay.
That's a good time to ask you your thoughts.
Well, I mean, the thing that comes to mind first is that, isn't it the case that the first Exodus is perhaps the most important part of Jewish identity?
Yes.
Okay. And so, maybe that suggests that we as the church should be thinking about this second Exodus that even Zechariah is telling us about as ultimately what we will be identified by. It's not easily identifiable by us right now, and it certainly looks like things are going in completely the opposite direction. But that's what will define us.
And it even shows, when you look at the Old Testament law, what is the constant theme? The reason you do this is because the Lord redeemed you out of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
It is always redemption. And of course, we have to understand that it wasn't a true spiritual redemption. They weren't saved through the Exodus in the ultimate sense. And the Holy Spirit did not come upon the Israelites as a whole and seal them in the first Exodus. It's only a picture. But even in the picture, the whole motivation for all they do for God is redemption. You were once slaves, and God redeemed you and brought you here. And that, of course, reminds us of all of our motivation, right?
Amen.
Because of what Christ has done for us.
Absolutely.
And so that brings us to Zechariah's question in verse 4. As he's watching this vision, he's seeing these chariots come through the gap in the mountains, and they head off in these different directions, and ultimately they end up in two directions. Zechariah asks the angel, the interpreter angel, "What are these, my Lord?" Which obviously he knows what chariots are, but he's asking a more detailed question. What are they doing? And so the angel responds, these are going to the four winds. Now there's a few translations that translate it, these are the four winds, identifying the chariots as winds. But I think, the one you read is going to the four winds, which is a little more faithful to the Hebrew, though ultimately it would end up having the same meaning, because the four winds are sort of going out in the four directions. So either way, but it's probably more faithful the way the English Standard read. They're going the way of the four winds. They're going to where the winds go. And so verse 6 then ends up explaining the direction each took. And by the second part of verse 6, they're only going north and south through the valley, running between the mountains. And they're described, and the chariots are further described with the horses being all powerful in verse 3. And then in verse 7, again, they're called strong. And so remember, this is a parallel with the vision in vision 1. But notice the difference, because even when you have a parallel, you're always going to have a little different perspective. And so in vision 1, the angels on the horses go out, and what's highlighted is their omniscience. Remember, we talked about their eyes, the 7 eyes. But notice what's highlighted here is not their omniscience, it's their omnipotence, their power. And so we see a different aspect. Back in vision 1, they're taking notice of everything that's happening to God's people. They see everything. Now in vision 7, God is coming with power to do something. And so there's a parallel with the first vision, but now we've moved even closer as final judgment is approaching. So what is highlighted is the power of the Lord. And that's what the return of Christ is. It's the Lord coming in power to judge. Let me stop there. And what are your thoughts on that explanation?
I'm afraid I don't have anything unique or helpful to contribute at this point.
Oh, just make something up. Sing a song.
Yeah.
See, if we were doing this in a studio where we had a camera, you could just show one of your internet pictures.
That's right. I could definitely turn it on for the camera, but
Every time we had a different aspect of the vision, you just flash the picture up there. And if anyone has their little kids in the room, they're all screaming at this point in fear.
Sorry, time out. The art for promoting the podcast was better this past week than it was the week before, right?
Yeah, it was good. It looked
good.
like a movie.
I know. The week before, I was like, I got nothing. This is the best I can do. But anyway.
All right, let's move on now to where this is all going, because this is only setting up what's going to happen. And where this is all going is they end up in verse 7, coming down to the earth. They're patrolling the earth. They're very impatient to go. In other words, it's time. No more waiting is the picture. Excuse me. And then finally in verses 7 and 8, we have judgment. Now it's written so briefly here you almost don't see it. And again, you can go to the parallel section at the end of Zechariah and get more information, which we won't be able to do this time. But remember that chariots are used in warfare. And so even the picture of chariots shows us that God has now come as a warrior to bring judgment. And so in the first 6 vision, there's always some aspect of judgment coming. And it's usually just spoken of as something future. But now that we're in vision 7, the chariots have now arrived on the earth. And so we see the progression, even though there's really no explanation of the judgment. But we do see who the judgment is against by this phrase, the land of the north. And you may have noticed that it starts with the 4 directions. Then you have chariots going north and south. But notice how it only ends on the north. The land of the north in verse 8 becomes the chief target. Now, what was in the north? Babylon was in the north. That's where they always were. They were always, the people of the north. And even in the 3rd vision, when God's people they had spent 70 years in Babylon, and even though, officially it had become Persia, it was still, in version 3, it said, flee from the land of the north. And so Babylon throughout the Bible becomes this symbol of the hostile satanic world against God's people. That's how Babel started, right? A tower seeking to create a false religion that would then persecute the true believers. And so God intervened.
Right.
And so Babylon becomes the symbol, the land of the north. And then in Daniel 11, the Antichrist is called the king of the north. And so again, king of the evil forces, those final satanic forces that will persecute the church. And so what we have, Kline says in verses 7 and 8, is the judgment of the Antichrist and his forces. This is the end of the world. And there is an Antichrist figure, and we can debate and argue what that looks like, but there is a figure of an Antichrist, of a person that unites the forces against the people of God. And so that's exactly what we're seeing. In Ezekiel 38 and 39, the final nation that persecutes the church is called Gog, king of the north. The nation and the king, Gog and Magog. And so Gog, king of the north, it says in Ezekiel 38, he sets up a rival on Mount Zaphon. So you have a fake Mount Zaphon in a sense, where the Antichrist has lifted himself up as a false god, a ruler, in a sense. And so there's a rival Mount Zaphon, there's a rival Christ, a phony, and they set themselves up to be rulers and to destroy the church. And so in Revelation, Gog Magog comes back, and there's a battle that's after the 1,000 years. And that shows that the millennium in Revelation must precede the second coming of Christ, which sort of goes against the heart of dispensationalism, which has the millennium after the return of Christ to the earth. Because you have a Gog-Magog battle. It's the final battle before Judgment Day. But the millennium is first. The 1,000 years is first. And so in Zechariah 6, the land of the north becomes the central location of judgment, because it's the gathering against the mountain of God, against the presence of God on earth, against the church. It's the final insurrection, Kline calls it. And so in Zechariah 6, you have a counterattack, because the church is being pressed against, the church is about to be destroyed, and yet God brings a counterattack with these chariots against the nations who have gathered. And of course, this is drawn out even more in the book of Revelation. And so the final battle is just very briefly pictured by the coming of these chariots to the land of the north. And the reason it's pictured so briefly, and we know it, is because verse 8 is after the battle. Verse 8 is the victory. And that's, well, what we'll end, but I'll ask you if you have any thoughts first.
Well, this whole time I've been scanning the section of the book this week, because I remember him saying that north in some particular place, and now I can't locate exactly where I was thinking of, wasn't referring to geographical north. I take it he was taking it as referring to a place of ultimacy. Do you know what part I'm talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you said is true. Obviously, if you look on a map, Babylon would be more north than Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, it's not exactly north as we would look on a compass, but it's northeast, and certainly in figurative language, you could say it's north. And so Babylon being north then becomes the picture here. And so, yeah, as long as we see this as simply figurative language. But in a literal sense, you do have to go north to get to Babylon. So even the vision would have some geographic sense to the Israelites when they first heard it. All right, well, do you want to go to the final section?
Let's do that.
Okay. So we said that verse 8 is after judgment. That's why we know that in one brief verse, we have Judgment Day, because we have what Kline calls the Spirit Sabbath. Now, some interpreters have misunderstood verse 8 and suggest that you have more judgment in verse 8. So the coming down, in a sense, the Spirit is coming in judgment. But really, it's a setting down. It's God's Spirit. It's the results of judgment. And you can match that with Vision 6. In Vision 6, the woman wickedness landed in Shinar, which is Babylon, and was enthroned in a temple. We talked about that earlier. In Vision 7, the Spirit lands in Shinar again, in Babylon, but because God has cleared her in judgment, the Spirit now glorifies this area, glorifies the earth, and the Spirit rests. It's a Sabbath rest. It's former enemy territory that can now be glorified. And so that's what it means when the Spirit alits and is enthroned here. He is glorifying the new earth. And so we have the two mountains in Deuteronomy, where the Lord is pictured as victorious over the Canaanites. Now the Lord is victorious over the world. It's time for the theocracy, just like the Lord instructed Israel to establish a theocracy. Now God himself will establish the theocracy where he will have perfect rule in peace with no enemies. And so we have to understand the Sabbath rest. You go all the way back to the Old Testament in Genesis and Exodus. After the victory over Egypt and the Canaanites, God rested in his tabernacle and then temple. So Psalm 132:8 calls the temple God's resting place. And so the pattern is God fights, he is victorious, he has a place for his people to live because he was victorious, and he rests. And that's really the creation pattern. We talked about that at one time earlier, that the darkness and the waters are pictured in Genesis 1 as enemies that have to be defeated because they are keeping God's people from living on dry land where they can see and fulfill the creation mandate. And so God has to separate the waters. He has to separate the light from darkness. He has to create light. He doesn't create darkness. And he doesn't create the waters. He separates them. And again, fulfilling this picture of God defeating our enemies. And then once we have a place to live with God, God rests in our presence. And that's exactly what you have here in Zechariah. God comes down and defeats the enemies, trying to destroy his people. And now they have a safe place to live, and God rests, and his spirit enters his Sabbath rest. And so let me just read from the book here, because he summarizes it so beautifully. Zechariah's seventh vision answers to these prototypes. It prophesies the ultimate granting of Solomon's prayer for God's saving action and the perfecting of the pattern of the wilderness procession from Sinai to establish the Lord's sovereignty over Canaan on Zion. The Lord rises up from his royal resting place on the mountains of bronze, up from the ark of his strength, and, as symbolized by the going forth of the chariots, he sets out on his judicial mission, accompanied by the heavenly forces associated with his ark throne. Then, the mission of judgment concluded, the Lord resumes his sovereign repose on his chariot throne, which has brought him to rest in what had been enemy-occupied terrain, but now and forever is his unchallenged royal domain.
Oh, that is great.
And that's, my friends, why you should read Meredith Kline.
I mean, that really sums up well the entire section that we're dealing with in this episode.
Right. And if you look at the parallel vision, or the parallel oracle, I should say, in Zechariah 14, it also pictures the new heaven and earth where God rests. And so the word for rest in Hebrew is a key term because it's always pictured what God does after judgment. Kline brings up Isaiah 25:10. The hand of the Lord will rest on this mountain, and Moab will be trampled in their land as straw is trampled down in the manure. And so what you have here is, in verse 8, is a fulfillment of Genesis 2, of God entering his Sabbath rest. It's what Exodus 20 is pictured in the rest for Israel. And we'll save our discussion of the Sabbath to the next book, when Kline has a large section on the Sabbath day in the New Covenant. But we certainly have the ultimate fulfillment here. And even in Genesis 1:2, as the very beginning, you have the Spirit is enthroned over the world. The Spirit is hovering. It's a temporary picture of the future reality, where the Spirit will rest upon the world and glorify the world. And Zechariah 6:8 is that fulfillment. And that's where we can close. I thought maybe we should just remind people that coming judgment is an aspect of a proper gospel proclamation. And we can't leave it out. And it's very unpleasant, and it should be, and we should teach it very solemnly and seriously. Remember that our people have family and friends on their way there, so we should never do it lightly or with any type of glee. It should always be, even the way it's presented here, when we're actually preaching the gospel. But if we simply leave it out because it's not popular or unpleasant, there's really no good news without first people understanding the bad news.
Amen.
What is deliverance if we don't even know what we're being delivered from?
Exactly. I mean,
Go ahead, yeah.
I was just going to say, I'm reminded of when Paul met with, I can't remember which Roman government official that it was, but the text says in Acts that Paul talked to this guy about the coming judgment, among other things. But, I mean, you get the sense that Paul couldn't talk about the gospel without having set up the judgment context for why the gospel was even necessary.
Yes.
And it sounds like that's exactly what you're saying here.
Yes. And that may be a good place to stop. And then the second half of this vision goes in somewhat of a different, unique direction. So we'll look to that next week, Lord willing.
Okay. Well, that was exciting. Thank you very much, Todd, for that discussion. I appreciated it.
Sure.
All right. We would love to hear what you think about this episode. You can email us your thoughts, your questions, your comments at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can tweet at us. I am at Machen Guy. Todd is at T Bordeaux. The podcast itself is at glorycloudpod. I am also on Instagram as at Machen Guy, and you can join the discussion in the Meredith Kline Facebook group. Just let the admins know that you listen to the podcast, and they can get you added. And Lord willing, next week will be the final episode of Glory in Our Midst, and Todd and I will talk to you then.